Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. I am Ursula Cullen and I'm here from FlowForma. Today I'll be hosting this event, Process Automation Trends, uncovered by Forrester's John Bratton-Sevick. Before we get started, I'll just quickly run through some housekeeping tips. So today's webinar is being recorded, and for any assistance during the webinar, please email info@flowforma.com and someone there will be able to guide you. Your lines are muted for the duration of this webinar, but if you do have any questions for our panelists today, please pop your questions into the chat box. And after the webinar, we will share a copy of the recording, and we just ask you to complete a really short feedback survey at the end as well. So today, I'm delighted to be joined by John Bratton-Sevick, Senior Analyst from Forrester. John's research focuses on citizen development, low-code development platforms, and also digital process automation. Paul Stone joins us as well from FlowForma. He's the product strategist and he's highly accomplished in IT professional who is the go-to product expert from both a business and a technical perspective. Paul works closely with FlowForma clients, supporting them the delivery of FlowForma's business process management tool. Welcome, guys. So without further ado, I think we'll get straight into our Q&A session where I'll interview both John and Paul to understand their insights in some of the most topical process automation trends. So for this, we don't have any slides, so I'm going to just stop sharing my screen. And guys, we will have a lovely chit chat for the next 30 to 40 minutes. And guys, for our audience, if you do have questions throughout the way, please pop them into the chat and we will go through them at the end. So we'll get right in. So the first topic I'd like to discuss with you guys is citizen development. So there's a lot of talk about citizen development at the moment. And John, maybe you can start off. Is it real? Is it here to stay? And what are your thoughts?
Sure, thank you. Well, it is real and it is here to stay. I sometimes liken where we're at to where business was at a few decades ago when the personal computer was just beginning to enter the office environment. And if you recall, if you're old enough to recall and you're working in an office at that time, computers were seen as arcane and there were only a few people who had them. And there were the computer people and the non-computer people, and they were approached as something we have to carefully govern and all that. And now, you know, using a computer is ubiquitous. Like we're using it right now. It's part of just doing business and being a white collar worker. I think what we call citizen development, or people who aren't technical specialists making applications, doing technical work, developing software, basically, I think it's going to become as common as the computer. It's basically, at least in my view, the future of work. So if you think about all the trends in business, everything being software driven, everything turning into software, the definition of digital being we have all our business expressed in software and it's constantly changing and we're automating the heck out of things and everything. That just absolutely necessitates business people doing software work. Like if your business is completely expressed in software, that means the business people have to own and iterate on and change that software and control it. So long term, I think this is basically just the future of how business is going to be done. What's really interesting is that isn't just a theory. We see it happening at modest scale. A few thousand developers at a time, I think, are the biggest examples I've seen personally. But I know a lot of large firms are working on how do we roll this out to hundreds of thousands of business people? How do we do that practically? What are our processes and tools going to be to do that? And I know that, at least in my job at Forrester, it's the most common question I get on Lowcode is, how do we do this? How do we get one of these products and scale it out to tens or hundreds of thousands of business people so they can start up-leveling all the paper and spreadsheets and whiteboards and phone calls and emails and nonsense that goes into running most businesses in the real world. So it's quite real. I think it's, as I say, it's the future of work and how the workforce will be taught to think in software. It's by making it with these abstracted tools. And the big firms are working on doing it at real, legitimate, serious scale and working through the problems. So it's a big deal. It's like an economy affecting sort of deal in the long term, in my view.
Yeah, absolutely, John. I'd certainly see that reflected in our client base and the people who are coming to us to look at FlowForma, where basically there's obvious pressures in IT in terms of their ability to deliver at the pace that the business needs them to deliver at. And they're now looking to citizen developers as a solution to that. And citizen developers seem to be more than willing to put their foot in and try it out, and often with very good results. So it's definitely, we see it as a way of the future, and what we're seeing is an upwelling trend of people being interested in taking on and making that step into citizen development. If you look to maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago, it was a really big deal for a business worker to actually go and build a solution. But now there's much more aptitude for it. And I think the recent events with COVID and so on have really made a change there. They've kind of propelled people to realize they've got to make a change in the way they work to cope with the change that COVID has brought around, and remote working and so on. And this has just spurred people on further to try out citizen development. And,
Yes.
yeah, and as you were saying, it's being implemented not just on an individual level, but on an organizational level as well, where organizations are saying, okay, well, citizen development is the way we want to go in the future. It's part of our strategy, and they're putting strategic changes in place to change the culture to actually enable that to happen. It's really exciting.
It is very exciting. It's a bigger deal than most topics I deal with. It's a really big deal.
And I suppose Nocode is really driving the citizen development movement, and governance is especially important. But John, what's your thoughts and your opinions in that side of things?
Governance. So that's the big, hairy, difficult question that most people are working on. That's the point of friction. So basically, approaching this, and you think about the long-term, scale you're trying to go for, and how you're trying to embed this as a competency in the business. Like, it's just how business is done. It's just a white-collar skill. That means that how you go about governance is different, right? Because you're not just trying to delegate what IT does. If you're just trying to delegate what IT does, then business will not do it. They will go back to whatever tools they have already, right? Because nobody wants to jump from a completely ungoverned way of working environment to a highly prescribed life cycle and testing testing expectations and support, the whole thing, right? There's this huge gulf between the way IT builds very important systems and business people just get their work done, like us on our keyboards or whatever, doing our email. So the way firms are going about it, there's sort of 3 patterns where they're basically trying to balance autonomy, right? So you want to make people at least somewhat autonomous to build apps with what I guess I'd call pragmatic control or pragmatic assessment of risk, right? So you don't want to have health and safety problems because somebody wrote an app for prescribing drugs or something like that. So you got to think about use cases and what level of training or access do people have or whatever. PII is a big deal, like how people would use data sources with sensitive information, like do you expose integrations and that sort of thing. That's one of the questions people think through. But the sort of 3 basic patterns people are taking to it that I've observed in my research so far are first, what I call the privateer model. So that's just a cute name. What it really means is within some kind of self-contained unit, like a business unit or a big department or whatever, there is a small team that is business first. Often process people tend to fill this role. They might be, moderately technical, but not developers. I mean, maybe they can build reports or something. That would be a skill set, or they're good with Excel, right? But basically, they become a sort of a specialist, semi-dedicated team on the given platform. So you're in the mortgage arm of the bank or whatever, and there's 3 or 4 people on this team, and they use the Lowcode platform to basically build the apps that business unit needs. And that's sort of controlling the who. So you say, okay, there's a small team. It works on stuff that's logically owned by the business unit. IT prescribes use this platform, deal with integrations this way, perform platform hygiene in this way when you maintain users and whatever. But otherwise, you're on your own. We trust you. We know you have a certain way of doing things. You are moderately technical. You report to the executive of the business unit, and you just take care of business and call us if you need anything, right? And that's sort of it's a modest way to start, but it's very effective, because effectively it means it doesn't have all the cultural trappings of IT, but effectively they're like local IT, right? And they can just turn on a dime and reprioritize. I call it the privateer because I interviewed a firm where they did this. It was the mortgage example. and the leader of the team, or I think it was the executive of the business unit, described that team as a pirate ship because they could sail around and get done whatever they wanted to get done. And I mean, they did a great job with it. They digitized all these paper processes, increased efficiency and data and visibility and the whole thing, right? They took all this manual junk that was in this fairly large mortgage arm of a bank and turned it into apps as business people, as a process team, basically. So that's sort of one approach, is where you say, okay, we're gonna have these small teams embedded in certain places. We're gonna prescribe how they work, and then we're gonna let them work within their four walls. And then when you get into, big inter-business unit type projects, that's when it kicks up to other people. The second approach is what I think more people think of when they think of citizen development, which is sort of a pure democratization. So that is, anybody in the firm can develop at any time, kind of self-service. You just go and do it. Typically, the way that works then is the way the platform's configured restricts what you can do with it. So if the first model restricts who, like just these small teams, the second restricts what. So we don't give you integrations. You can't do integrations. If you need to integrate, that's a different technology or a different path. Or maybe the integrations are very limited, right? That would be one example of a lever that restricts it. Or maybe just the nature of the platform is such that there are inherent just scale limiters, right? Like, I have so many records or so many objects or whatever. So you just sort of inherently are stuck with smaller use cases without getting special approval or whatever. So the IT team or COE or whoever it is that sets this thing up, they're comfortable letting people sort of self-serve to whatever degree they want to, replacing spreadsheets and digitizing paper forms and that sort of thing. And the firm I saw that did that really well was a telecom in Asia, where they got a platform that was very good for that, very easy to use, and they could configure it in such a way so you were pretty limited in the integrations and so on that you could do. And they did a hackathon to attract early adopters to the program, and they got 300 some people who showed up, and they had remarkable results even up front, where they made quite a few very substantial apps that save a lot of money and time and things like that, small apps that IT never would have gotten to. And there was so much momentum out of it, with those people becoming kind of the early evangelists and adopters, and now they have regular quarterly trainings and more hackathons. And I mean, the goal is basically that everybody in this enterprise can build an app whatever they want. So that's kind of how they're doing it. So that's sort of anybody can do it, but what you do is constrained by the way the platform's configured, and sort of self-service, and you coach people on how to do problem solving with software and that kind of thing. And the third is the most complex, but it's probably where enterprises will evolve to, because that's ultimately where the biggest returns probably will be, which is kind of a more federated model, where, okay, the low-code platform is a service or a governed platform within IT in some central way, and there's like a COE that owns it, and they don't just prescribe the rules, they also work on it. So they develop and co-develop with people, as well as coach and teach and train and all that good stuff. And then depending on the context, right, the business unit, the rank or training of the developer, the environment it's going to be in, the data that's being used, right, the criticality of the application or whatever, who works on it and how they work on it changes, right? So there might be one process for simple apps that are in your department and we don't care. There might be another process where you're going to access this data source, you have to go to the data owner, and then you have to get approval before you deploy it. And then it's like, well, you're rewriting a core app module, we're really going to do this one ourselves, right? And then there's collaboration between like the COE developers and the local developers or whatever. So that's the most complex, because that's multiple processes, it's multiple assets, it's multiple teams, it's different paths for everything. But that's probably the most mature, because then you get, you got coders coding, right, as needed. You got people self-serving, and you got kind of that collaboration in the middle, where maybe custom components are fed to the local developers, and there's that working together where they get coached, or an app can go from small to very large and important and whatever. So that's kind of the products don't perfectly support all that in an automated way yet. Right? There's a lot of manual processes to manage that sort of governance, but that's probably where it's going. That's probably more how technology will look in general in the future. Is there's this unbroken spectrum of technologists, from IT to business people, working on some sort of shared platform, doing different kinds of work. So anyhow, those are sort of the three models, and yeah, that's all I got to say on that.
Yeah, like from my perspective, we've been doing this citizen developer business now for quite a long time, and over time we've seen all those three models. Like in the early days, it was very much the first model, the privateer model, and then more recently we finally landed on federated, where you actually have a controlled environment. and how the returns that you get out of it kind of rise as you go through those three models. Like as you go from a privateer, you get a certain return. It's always good. But as you go up to federated, you're really getting significant returns to the business. Like it's a bigger investment of your time, but you get a fantastic return at the end of the day. And like you were saying, it's all to do with how much risk people want to evolve. Like IT, they're always going to be there. They're always going to be at the very least managing the infrastructure. But depending on how much they want to get involved and how much they want to let go and pass the risk to the business process owners themselves, that's a decision that they need to make. But they can now kind of look at the returns they're going to get as well and make that decision in the context of, what are they going to get out of it? So, because there's plenty of real world examples now of people adopting this whole citizen developer approach and applying one of those three models, Joe. So, yeah, it's a really exciting time again to be seeing how the market is evolving and how people are getting value out of citizen development movement.
Yes, it really is. We're right when people are starting to place their big bets. That's where we are in the cycle.
There's probably still a lot of confusion around the low code and no code in the market. John, maybe you can simplify for our audience here and share what the main differences are.
Sure. There's some history to the term low code. It was coined by Forrester 6 or 7 years ago, when my predecessor was doing research and noted that there was this new generation of development tools that people were really adopting. And they'd been enabled by the cloud, and they were very, very abstracted, right? Didn't have to write code, or you had to write very little code. So at that time, he made the decision to call it low code, because the theory was, well, you can always write some code if you want to, and in enterprise, you often need to, at least for a few things here or there. That was the idea. So there's a lot less coding, but calling it low code. What's transpired in the meantime is the platforms themselves have obviously gotten much more mature. So what you need to code is less. You can pretty much write complete apps in all these platforms without any actual lower level coding language. That's pretty normal. And there's sort of another segment of the market that calls itself no code. And what's represented by that generally, and this isn't 100% of the time, but most of the time, when a product says we're no code, we're not low code, what they mean is they're aimed very much at that citizen development model. They're aimed at the non-engineer, the person who not only can't code, but doesn't understand how software comes together, right? So they don't have an engineer's mind for what it takes to make an application that works. So we have the segments named a little differently. We labeled them by the persona at Forrester, but if you're out in the market, sort of the coded language, if you will, no pun intended, is low code generally connotes something that is more technical and more aimed at the professional, not always. No code usually specifically means we're aimed at business people. That's our mission in life. That's why we're around.
I think that's a great summary there. But Paul, you might want to add something on.
Oh, just from a FlowForma perspective, yeah, we're definitely aimed at those business people. So we call ourselves no code and are proud of it. The only thing we'd say is that in our case, we do kind of have a breadth of functionality there that you can build really complex applications using no code. But I guess we're a little unusual in that respect. And it's just because of the way we started, and we started off from the very beginning as a no code vendor, and then we expanded out the application over a period of many years to kind of cater for many different business scenarios, and also to handle things that we're trying to remove coding out of every aspect of the system. So for example, integrations, we'll talk about a little bit later, but to try and come up with a no code version of integrations, a no code version of this, a no code version of that. So we gradually expanded and sprawled out to cover off as many scenarios as we can. So we'd say we're no code, but we're a little bit different in that we target that business user 100%, citizen developer all the way, but we kind of cater for even complex applications as well.
And let me ask you, Paul,
yeah.
Can you write code somewhere in FlowForma if you want to?
Well, yes, you can if you want to. Little tiny bit, right?
Little tiny bit. It's not a literal label that means aimed at the business person, which of course you are. That's what you do.
Yeah. Hey, can I just tell you one little story? Actually, I actually wrote a little line of code in one of our business applications I was building with a customer. As soon as I wrote that line of code, and it was just a single line of code, the guy immediately said, he was a senior engineer, he was a very clever person. He said, as soon as I wrote it, he said, no, no, that's not allowed. We're not doing that. We're engineers. We don't write code. You're not allowed to do that. Give me a different solution. And we had to put a little thing in our roadmap to actually get rid of that line of code, put a new feature in. And that's what we've been doing for a very long time. So that's just to give you an example of the kind of people who are using kind of our application, the citizen developers. Like literally a line of code is a problem for them. So we've got to kind of cut it down, cut it down, cut it down. But John, you're right. We do give you a get out clause in there. You actually can add a little bit of code when you need to. So
I think there's a strong architectural argument for not writing code, right? Like you're putting it on the vendor to put in their tooling. And I get theoretically, well, I want to be able to go beyond it when I have to, but that's, if the platform is powerful enough, that's largely theoretical, right? And having less code to own as your problem in the long term is better.
it's
Right?
better.
You want
Yeah,
tools developed from the company you're buying from. That's what you want. You want it in the tooling. There's
Yeah.
huge value in that.
And with new ways of working now, a lot of organizations are looking to digitize at scale. So guys, maybe you can share some tips on how organizations can best do that. Maybe your top three or top five. I know there's not one answer fits all, but give us your best shot.
I mean, well, you got to do it, right? So even digitizing at scale itself is kind of a, I don't want to call it a contentious topic, but I don't think people quite grasp what it means, right? So if you look at our data, because we do this survey every year where we look at process data and so on, it's like staggering numbers of companies still rely pretty heavily on paper and spreadsheets to do things. I think it's 80% of firms have at least a few process dependencies on paper. That's the newest number. And 99%, which sounds absolutely right because we're all familiar with it, still have some process dependencies on passing spreadsheets around, right, where we email them or whatever. And that's really not digital or digitized at all, right? That's spreadsheets at best are a poor analog metaphor and paper's paper, and really shouldn't have any of that in my view, or very tiny percentages. So what that kind of tells you is that companies have not reflexively gone about turning everything into software. They haven't said, no, we need everything in the company in bits and bytes, right? They see it more of as a selective investment that they do, with a dedicated technical team or through procurement where they go buy a big app. So you buy an app or you have a specific project where you scope it and you get the requirements, then you build it with engineers and what have you. What needs to happen is people have to have sort of a cultural attribute, a basic view of the subject where they go, no, in general, our default position is anything we do as a company, any policy, any process, any procedure, any piece, any stick of data, any experience, any bit of institutional knowledge, whatever, brand, the whole 9 yards, we need to turn that into apps. We need to turn that into software in bits and bytes. That's what we need to do. So like that, just making that mental shift is very different for sort of, I call it the MBA style of thinking, where you want to look at like a business case for every, again, technology is still seen as a selective investment. It has to become just the way you do things. And then you get into the economics of it, which is where, well, that's why low code is so important. And citizen development, the next level, is so important, is that's what makes the economics of that viable, right? When the development is so much faster and easier and cheaper, and you can expand the developer pool to people outside of those engineers or IT, that's when you can actually do those sorts of things. That's what you can actually get all the paper and the spreadsheets and the whiteboards and all the junk that makes up real business, which I should add is not just it's not just trivial things. We tend to think, oh, spreadsheets and paper, that's little personal product. Nonsense. One of my first projects as a developer was working for the largest firm in the world, where they were managing $100 million worth of stuff, which for them was just a rounding error. But it was $100 million worth of work. And it was basically done on spreadsheets. It was basically done on spreadsheets across 20 people beating these spreadsheets on a line. And I, as the not very technical at the time developer, went in and turned those spreadsheets into a really nice set of applications that worked really well. And the point is, that was not trivial at all, right? And almost every firm that's the case, that very important things impacting revenue and customer experience and quality and all sorts of things are encoded in these workarounds around these big systems that are supposed to be doing that job. So one of two things has to happen. The big systems need to change a lot, or we need to build a whole lot of bespoke apps. And I think we're going to be more of the bespoke apps. That's my view of the market. And low code is really the only practical economic way to do it. And I think citizen development is important because that's where you get the workers and you get the people with the process knowledge and you can iterate in the whole 9 yards. So you got to go, we are going to digitize everything at scale. And then you go, okay, well, how do we do that? Well, we got to have stuff like low code because that's the only way we can do it fast and change it easily. And then you go, well, we need a lot more people to do it who are technically minded, which is citizen development. So that's kind of I got into a lot of things there, but I mean, reflexively turn stuff into software. That's got to be where it starts.
Yeah, like absolutely from the FlowForma customer base, you can see that. Like we had a client that came along who just a couple of guys wanted to digitize processes in the business. I think there was like 200 people in the business, and you know, we trained them, but we have an onboarding program that kind of trains up people to get going of citizen development, you know, and normally what people do is they get a process or two digitized in about 8 weeks time, right? And they're very happy with that. They get an ROI quickly, okay? But these guys, they actually took the bull by the horns, and they decided, no, we're going to go full hog on this. We're going to digitize the hell out of our processes, because they were working on paper and spreadsheets. And they built 42 processes in 10 weeks, digitized 42 processes in 10 weeks, which is really crazy. But they successfully went live with them. And it really, I guess, they took that mantra. They thought, okay, well, you know, we're going to be digital all the way. We're not just going to digitize 1 or 2 little processes and see how it goes. We're going to go the full hog. And they digitized an incredible amount in a very short space of time. And you can only achieve that using low-code tools. No IT department could ever deliver that kind of speed. So it's a real change in how people operate. And as people are scaling up, like you mentioned earlier along about the federated approach, like we got a client who decided at board level that, you know, this was the way they were going to go. They were going to adopt citizen development. And they had about 400 processes. And they put a training program together, trained up 60 people. And I think 30 of those people actually delivered processes, and they delivered about 120 processes in 2 months. So it really, you know, the tools are in place, I guess, to allow you to scale. And then you have to have the mindset of how you're going to do that, and a commitment as well that, you know, citizen development is going to be the way of the future, and you're going to get results out of it. And if you have that commitment, the tools are there, you're able to do it. And we now have like several case studies, and I know Forrester will have plenty of them too, that show how success can be achieved.
Indeed.
Let's move on now to a conversation around DPA versus RPA. So COVID-19 and customer-obsessed transformation has really pushed automation front and center, but it is difficult to choose among process automation tools. And what is the difference between DPA and RPA? And maybe you can explain to our audiences when best to use each of those tools.
Okay. I'll try not to be too technical in my response. I don't want to confuse anybody. Big picture, the relationship between the two is DPA should be your foundation for process automation work, and RPA should be a service you selectively apply. Okay, so that's big picture. That's how the two fit together. The difference is DPA are basically platforms for building applications. So you're building screens, there's data, you're notating a process of some kind, right? It's an app that sits somewhere and runs, and you interact with it as a user. RPA is more for tasks. So it's literally recreating what a person would do with a keyboard and mouse. Okay, so the clicks and the keystrokes, like a macro with an Excel sheet, right? So think of it basically as macros on steroids. That's what RPA is. So you're not really building like applications, right, with experiences and data and process notation and then that sort of thing and state. You're basically taking what you do, pounding your keyboard, and just having a little macro run instead, right? So that's not very sustainable, right? That's useful in certain cases. You know, like let's say you need to get data out of a system, and there's no way to get data out of that system without using a mouse and keyboard because it's really old, right? Or it'd be just an enormous investment to expose the data some way. Well, one workaround is to have a little script, a bot, an RPA bot, go do what a person would do with a mouse and keyboard. Click, download, copy, paste, whatever, right? But that's very selective. You should only use that when you must, because it's fragile. If the screen layout changes, you know, that can cause problems. It's not part of an overall process model. It's just not a very good way to do digital things. It's literally, I often say to people, it's literally Henry Ford's faster horse. Like we have workers doing work, and we're like, we want that to be done just faster, and it's not very transformative, right? Whereas DPA is more like moving from a horse to a car. It's like redefining the work, taking it, building it into data models, building it into screens, building it into an actual system, you know, with APIs and all that good stuff that actually, you know, provides much longer term, much more substantial business value. So RPA should always be subservient to DPA and always selectively applied. My simple way of labeling it is it's Henry Ford's faster horse. It's not the way to think about digital transformation and digitization. I hope that makes sense. Sometimes it can get hard because you get technical in the differences, but that's how I do it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like we've got quite a number of customers who bought into RPA first, so they kind of were sold on the hype of RPA. And it's not that RPA is a bad thing. It's that RPA has a limited set of uses, right? And when it's used in the right scenario, you can get fantastic results out of it. But it's not all about kind of managing human resources to achieve a business goal using a business process or using a small application to interact, a human being interacting with it to achieve results. The RPA really is quite a different beast, and somewhere along the way, people thought RPA was the ultimate answer. And the truth of it is, it's a great answer for certain scenarios, but it's not the only thing that you're going to need to automate and digitize your business. So you need other things as well. And kind of low-code DPA tools that should cover an awful lot of ground, where RPA tools and ERP systems, for example, they cover off some things, but there's an awful lot of human activity that basically can be automated using a DPA tool that RPA can never do. So
a best practice. I'm sorry, Paul. I thought you were done.
No, please carry on.
A best practice is to make sure the teams that are citizen development aside, let's say it's an IT team or a COE or something. A best practice is the team that's doing the low-code apps or the DP apps or whatever, because those are almost the same. Low-code is just a way of developing. That they also do the RPA work. Some products actually have both baked in. RPA is a service, but the point is that the same team has the range of tools at their disposal, so they can apply the right tool in the right context. When you separate those teams out, that's when you get into problems. And I should say, slightly bigger picture. One thing that astonishes me is I think one of the reasons we use RPA so much, or sometimes it's over applied, is because the whole software sourcing process is a little off, right? Because we've been trained to buy best of breed applications for a lot of things, and that's fine, that's good. But those best of breed applications, we're also trained not to customize them, so they don't do exactly what we want. So we have all these best of breed applications in our business, and we have people interacting with them. So our solution for making it work for us is replacing the people with bots. And the problem is the systems were made for people, but it's not working for you. So you're like, I'll replace the people and make it better. It's like your fundamental system architecture is out of whack. You get that, right? Like those systems were designed for people to interact with them. And that's what you bought. But then you're saying, I'm gonna throw the person out and put a bot in its place. It's like, that doesn't make a lot of sense.
Doesn't make a lot of sense. Absolutely. And as you say, like it's a great statement there that the same people should configure the DPA and RPA because they're basically kind of complementary technologies. So
yeah, I always recommend that. Don't have two separate teams. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
So I know you've both briefly mentioned integrations throughout our conversations, but digital organizations now use multiple systems, multiple applications. But John, maybe you could start off and give a little bit of advice on to our listeners on how integration and process automation tools can work hand in hand.
Yeah. So there's a class of tools for integration. They're called integration platform as a service. We have coverage and expertise on all that. What you're finding is that a lot of low-code tools do similar things. So they aren't focused on that as a standalone service, but they do similar things. So they have a field of connectors, right? So sometimes it'll mature to where it's even hundreds of connectors. So you're effectively the same as one of those integration platforms in terms of the systems that are supported out of the box. And then there's tooling in the low-code platform for doing integration work, mapping fields from one system to another, doing transformation where you change the format of the data or manipulate it in some way and change it from a flat file into multiple tables or something and stick it in the other place or what have you. So practically speaking, what you find is a lot of the especially more mature DPA products, they're sort of doing the integration platform stuff to at least a decent level, right? Because that's kind of integral to what they're doing. They're going across different systems and they need integration. So that's one thing to keep in mind when you're buying them. But the other bit is, especially in this context of citizen development where we started, what I find is IT teams and engineers, they often worry too much about integration, by which I mean they won't take a single step on the path until the integration strategy is all worked out. And what I have noted is that there is enormous value with these tools that are especially aimed at the business person, even without any integration at all. So think of it as there are all these paper and spreadsheet and email and whatever else islands in your company. Making those into application islands is still about 10 times better than just leaving them. So you don't have to get hung up on the perfect governance strategy for how we will curate and selectively apply and present connectors, integration points, data lakes, whatever, to get started. The most important thing is just starting to digitize all that stuff, and don't wait for all the perfect integration rules and infrastructure and everything to do it, which is where I see people get hung up. So that's about the extent of my view on it. It's obviously an important subject. Sometimes it slows things down too much, as what I've seen. It shouldn't.
Yeah, like I'd reiterate that absolutely. You know, don't get hung up on integrations, because you can achieve so much without integrations. I think over probably 90% of our client base don't integrate their DPA platform with their backends and still achieve enormous value. Because as you said there, John, previously they've been working on paper and spreadsheets. Having a digital system, whether it integrates or not, is just such a massive step forward. You're already getting the benefit. But on integrations, then you're going to have to involve IT resources to code out your integrations, I guess, right? But like what we do at FlowForma is we try and we build our integrations so that they're usable by citizen developers, and that you have to do that in a certain way, because citizen developers not going to understand the technicalities, inevitable technicalities of system integration. So you have to present those integrations in a nice, clear format that's easy to use. But I would go back to what John was just saying there about the fact that, you don't have to have integrations to get great value out of digitizing a system. And the other thing that John said there that I found very interesting, and it's certainly very true, is the fact that you don't need to get perfection first time round. You know, you don't have to have a perfectly complete system with full integrations, etc. first time round. If you digitize something, aim for a draft and refine it over time. And you're going to get that value much more early on. You're going to get better adoption because people are going to use it. You refine it over time, people are going to see it getting better. And there's that's a very big thing, far greater, if you like, than having the system ultimately integrate to your SAP database, for example.
That's actually you said something really important there, Paul. There is an instinct. Again, this comes from the way technologists tend to work, the way process experts tend to work, the way we've been sort of trained to think because of, coding practices stretching back decades, to optimize before putting your hands to the keyboard. So having the process designed theoretically the optimal way before you turn it into software. And it's funny because when we talk about Agile, we're like, MVP, get out there, fail fast. But the moment you start talking about process, people are like, no, the process should be defined entirely in the abstract. And then, only then will we select the correct development technology and we'll develop it. It's like, going back to what I was saying earlier, reflexively, again, the barrier to entry is so low and it's so much faster, so much cheaper. And it's, again, democratized. So people are self-serving to some degree if you've done that. It should be reflexive to go, we have this process, how should it work? And you just start making it in the digital environment. Like that should be your first step. There's this artificial separation between process and digitization or programming or developing that is in so many cases not useful, but is embedded in the cultures and the practices of a lot of firms. What we need to get to is, it's not that you never plan, it's not that you never draw anything out. I'm not saying that, but we need to get way closer to the sort of live development. That's where you really see like magic. Like we just digitize stuff. Oh, it isn't good, tweak it. Continuous improvement, boom, and now it's real. And that's kind of how we gotta operate.
Definitely, and getting it into the hands of the actual people who use the system is so important, and getting that feedback directly from the people who use the system is just great, because you'll end up getting a system more quickly adopted, more successfully adopted by the business. And at the end of the day, adoption is what gets you the return on investment, right? Like if systems are adopted, if it's not used well, if it's not refined over time, that return on investment really is not going to be anywhere near as high. So getting an imperfect draft out there is so much better than waiting longer for perfection, and ultimately, potentially failing when you try to have something that is theoretically perfect. So
yeah. Paul, you mentioned adoption there, but John, you might share some tips on, how to best foster a culture of continuous process improvement in an organization.
It's an interesting subject because that's a whole, discipline and area and industry in itself, right? Even apart from technology.
Mhm.
I'll answer like a wizard and say both yes and no on a couple of things. One is we keep talking about citizen development and low code, how wonderful it is, and it really, really is. But it's hard to do. It's hard to introduce it all if the culture of the company doesn't encourage that sort of thing. So not the technology side, but just if the culture of the company is you have your job, it's Taylorism. You have your job, you operate in your job, and you don't have the time or the encouragement or the safety net to do anything else, right? Don't change things. We don't want you to change things. That's not what you do. We don't give you time to do it. We just operate, right? If that's how the business works, it's really hard to introduce this idea of, oh, everyone will be performing experiments in a digital environment, blah, blah. It's like, no, nobody's time for that. We don't do that. Are you joking? That's your problem. Just tell me what button to hit. So if that's your culture, thinking that you can just introduce this and just roll it out and everything will be great, it's no different than trying to do that apart from technology. Like, oh, we just want a bunch of problem solvers. We'll do some PowerPoints and everything will be fine. No, it's very, very hard. So that's one thing to consider is if you're thinking of going down this path, but you are sort of culturally not continuous improvement minded, it'll be hard. And I've seen examples where it's exactly that, where they do even say the privateer model. I can think of one firm as a very impressive example where they had a wonderful implementation of the privateer model because it was the process improvement people, the people who did projects. So that was their job. They did projects. So that worked fine. And then they tried to democratize further and train people, and it fell down because those people didn't have time to learn this stuff because that wasn't the culture of the firm yet, right? The project people did the project work. So they had some democratization in the sense of the project people now were doing digital work, but if you wanted to get into the rest of the workforce, it was like, yeah, we don't have time for that. So that can be very hard. The flip side of it is, what happens sometimes is when you find motivated people who want to use these platforms, they sometimes create this culture. Okay, so even if it's not the most continuous improvement minded environment, you get somebody who gets the bit in their teeth, and they're like, I really want to solve this thing, and it really makes me mad that these systems suck and we don't have systems, and I'm going to go make something of this low code thing and figuring it out. They end up running. They build these systems. They get recognized. It goes really, really well, and then and other people take interest and they start training them. And what happens sometimes is having that concrete medium where you can see the process and see the data and see the digitization of the screens, that tends to encourage a continuous improvement culture because now you have a thing you're looking at, right? It's not an invisible process or the theory of process. It's like, here's the process. Let's move that dial, right? So it kind of gives you that. In Lean, they say standard work is the foundation of continuous improvement. So what happens is when you digitize it, it's now a visible standard, especially if it's a process platform where it's literally notated as a process. So the natural inclination is to start tweaking it. And of course, you have more time if you've automated it, right? So you have time to start tweaking it. So it's hard to introduce, but sometimes the technology itself can create the culture because you see the process in the technology and you want to tweak it and you're getting the results. So it's not that you shouldn't try because you know they're out of the way, but no, it'll be a hard battle. And I mean, what you need to do is you need to try to make time for people to improve things, encourage them to improve things, allow them to make mistakes and experiment. That's sort of generic advice, but it's very true. You want people to be dissatisfied with the status quo and make things better, but in technology. And then that's where low code becomes the medium to really do that pretty effectively. So that's my view on it.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Like we've occasionally come across companies who have a culture of innovation, who actually have the culture in place where people have targets to actually innovate. So they actually are encouraged and are targeted on coming up with new ideas, improving their environment. And they have processes in place for continuous improvement where people can submit new ideas are evaluated, assessed, and etc. Fantastic. It's great news for us when we get to speak to those people. Brilliant. We can introduce a tool. We can do things. But then more often, I think, John, for us, it's a case of finding a champion. So we're finding a champion in the business who wants to try something out and wants to try a new way of working, and then does exactly what you just said. They basically go away, build out solutions themselves, show people the actual end results, and then those end results encourage them to jump onto the train, basically. And then gradually that expands into business and it scales up. But yeah, that second one at the moment is probably more prevalent in our customer base. But it is fantastic when you come across a company who usually a C-level have made a decision to how to introduce an innovation culture and to actually have the culture and the processes and mechanisms and roles, responsibilities, and everything in place before you arrive with a low-code platform.
If they have it already, it fits perfectly, because one of the fundamental principles of continuous improvement is that the people at a distance, the professional problem solvers, aren't the ones that should solve most of the problems. That's the people who are involved in whatever it is, that they should be the ones solving the problem. So if you kind of have that really embedded, then this is just with technology. It's like, oh, that makes sense. It fits perfectly in those environments. But those environments are rare. Most people are striving to be.
Guys, I really appreciate all your insights there. I think we covered a lot of trends, a lot of great topics. Again, I just want to remind the audience, if you do have any questions, to pop them in and we'll go to them at the end. But for now, Paul, I'm going to pop over to you for the next maybe less than 10 minutes or so. If you want to just fly through some slides, tell the audience a little bit more about FlowForma and some amazing success stories that we have. So I'll just share my screen here now.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks very much, Ursula. So just a little bit about FlowForma. It's obviously a digital process automation platform, and it allows you to digitize processes very quickly. It's targeted at those citizen developers, business users who want to take ownership of the development of solutions that allow them to execute the processes digitally and introduce automation and so on. So it helps to accelerate digital transformation within your company, because you're using those business resources to actually build out the solutions, not being dependent on IT bottlenecks, whether they're internally at the internal IT department or external IT providers. You can use those citizen developers who are a direct stake in this digital transformation to go and put that in place by digitizing processes. Ultimately, in doing that, you're introducing standardized processes, you're improving your compliance if you're in a regulatory environment, and of course, you're introducing efficiencies and you're reducing costs. So even the most basic digitization of a process versus spreadsheets and pieces of paper and email trails is going to introduce significant efficiencies. And this is where you're going to get a very fast return on investment on your implementations. So what we're going to do is talk about a couple of examples of our clients who achieved some efficiencies. And the first one we'll talk about is the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. They're a large university based in Liverpool, one of the oldest schools of tropical medicine in the world. And they decided to go for a no-code tool because they had a very small and busy IT department and didn't have the capacity to digitize lots of their systems that were out there running on spreadsheets and email chains and so on. So they quickly got 8 people trained up. It's a very short training cycle, and a lot of these no-code tools, FlowForma is no exception, have a short training cycle when we basically get you up to speed in a couple of days. And we got 8 people trained up, and then rather having those paper processes, and they decided to encourage people to actually start using FlowForma at digitizing processes. And they selected the finance department as being the main target for automation at the outset. So what they did was this particular model, they picked one department to start off with, trained those guys up, and within a year they'd automated and improved over 120 processes. So with these low-code tools, with FlowForma, you can digitize processes very quickly once you get trained up. And as John was alluding to earlier on, if you can do this quickly, demonstrate the results quickly, you can then start building momentum and start digitizing at scale. So they started off with the finance department, but that then expanded out to the general operations, HR, and so on. Okay, on the second one, we're going to talk about CVB Tideway. And the CVB Tideway is a very large construction project, civil construction project in London. And they wanted to drive compliance and visibility about their processes. So again, this is a company who was operating very largely on paper. And they wanted to move away from paper and digitize the large number of paper-based processes that they were executing. They had a number of different challenges, and it was a little bit difficult to figure out where to start. And this is a challenge that many companies find, that there's so many paper processes around. Which ones do you pick? Which ones do you start with? But there were some clear, we call them captain obvious processes, that basically there was obviously going to be a good reason to digitize these processes, and there would be a very visible impact across the company if these processes were digitized. And for them, they chose the project starter lever and site diaries processes. Why? Because there are so many, in this case, contractor workforce, so there's so many people coming in and going out all the time, that a starter lever process made a good place to start. And also site diaries was a process that every single person working on the construction project would have to do every single day. So they chose those two first processes to start, and again, get the message out, get momentum and support. Over the time they digitized processes, they were able to measure the saving that they were making on the processes, because of course digital processes are all recorded, so you record the time and effort spent on every task you do. And they measured that they saved over 700 hours on repetitive tasks. In addition to all of that, using digital process platform like FlowForma, you're actually storing all the data as well. So all of a sudden, you have a big data lake that happens automatically that you're able to report on, and they're able to report on statistics that they were never able to do when they're running on paper. Okay, Ursula, if you move on. Just to explain very quickly, FlowForma is a 3-in-1 tool. So what it does is it merges workflow, which is the execution of tasks in a business process to achieve a business goal, forms, which is the collection of data, and document handling management. So you can generate documents, you can pass those documents around, you can store the documents and manage the documents, as well as managing the data and also managing the actual workflow and assignments of tasks. And together, it all allows the people across the business to collaborate, work together to achieve business goals. The system operates on Microsoft 365, so all the data is saved in SharePoint, can also be replicated out into backend systems. Okay, enough of that, I guess. I could talk a lot about how FlowForma is built. So finally, to say that it's like we've got over 200,000 users. It's used across the globe in a whole variety of scenarios. And that wide coverage has helped evolve the product over the years, so that it can cater for a very wide range of business process scenarios at this stage. Okay. And just to show you some of the customers that we have, the main purpose of this slide is to show that we've got quite a range of customers in different sectors. So we don't focus on any one particular sector. We have a lot of customers, for example, in construction, also in financial services, healthcare, transport, and really quite a wide variety of clients. Why? Because the tool is very generic. As I said, it's designed really to solve any problem that you might have. Okay.
Great, thank you so much for that, Paul. Really appreciate that at the end. We've got a couple of minutes left, so we'll just pop into some questions for both yourself, John, and Paul. When we were asking people to register for this webinar, we gave them the opportunity to submit any questions for both of you guys. And one of the questions I thought was really interesting around engaging external stakeholders. And I know we didn't really cover that off in the interview section, so maybe this is the perfect time to chat about that. So when registering, this person asked if you would recommend that organization allow external users to input directly into business processes, or what would be your best approach in that area. So maybe John, do you want to kick off there, and Paul, you can add any comments at the end.
Yeah, I can start. I mean, of course, yes, certainly. I mean, I already established, I think, that like the philosophy should be turn everything about the business into software, and you engage with customers, so that should be turned into software too. Now, there's a couple caveats. One is sometimes people can do that unintelligently, by which I mean perhaps software can be applied in a way that doesn't work with your brand promise. So for example, I'll make a concrete something very simple that everybody can pretty much understand. Fancy restaurant. Do you want to order your $300 bottle of wine? Not that I've ever done that. On an iPad, or do you want a sommelier to come over and be like, yes, the 2017 blah, 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 blah is excellent. It has notes of like, which would, one is digital, but which one would you think lives up to the brand promise of that fancy restaurant you went to, right? So that, things like that are kind of basic CX principles that, especially when you're interacting with your customer, you don't want, you want to think about what supports your brand, right? Amazon, it's like click, boom, that's their brand. And so turning everything into software for everything makes sense for them, which I think is where more of it's going. So that's one caveat. So yes, certainly, but make sure it's consistent with your brand. The second is we keep talking about citizen development. Citizen developers absolutely work on customer-facing things. It totally happens. There's actually a class of tools where SaaS apps where they're building front-end customer-facing journey stuff that's meant to be done by business people and digital teams. So they're explicitly selling that to the market. But sometimes, or often, I would say a common practice is, when it is like a Cadillac experience, when it is like, the front and center thing your customers are going to be interacting with, especially if you're a large company, right? That's often going to be more done by your professional developers or your COE or whatever, or maybe even a different technology, depending. Though Lowcode is definitely used for customer-facing things too. So yes, certainly, but caveats apply.
Yeah, like from my perspective, again, I totally agree with what John's saying there, and end user experience is critical and so on. And I think that, like if I give some maybe specific examples of where people are using FlowForma for this kind of technology. So we've got a technology called Engage that allows people to participate in the process. They can fill in a form, let's say, as part of a step in the process. And one example I give there is we recently had a company who is basically uses FlowForma to create products inside their systems. And part of the one step in the process is if the product is supplied by an external supplier, the external supplier details had to be keyed in. And the admin clerk basically said, "Oh God, I wish this could be done by somebody else. Like, why do I have to key in? Like, I get a scanned image in an email. I got to open it up, key it into details." And the thing is that FlowForma can actually just present that step directly to the supplier. So that you can have a secure login. The supplier can just log in and fill in the form themselves, which of course made the admin clerk very happy. Basically, is getting the supplier to do the work, if you like, that she would have done. And of course, with the supplier doing the work, they have the responsibility. So it's up to them to get it right. And of course, the system can obviously validate the information that's being keyed in as well. So in certain scenarios, it makes a lot of sense where you can kind of externalize a step in the process because the work is actually being done by the external person, whether it's a supplier, a customer, or whatever. And that for a customer, it might be, let's say, the customer is setting up a new account with you and you want to recapture some information about the customer when it's setting up the account. But like it doesn't work in all scenarios, just like John was saying. If you had a branded experience, like that customer experience in a restaurant, absolutely, yeah. You want to have that personal touch, that personal interaction. So you don't necessarily want it sitting in a form on a tablet. Yeah. So so there's certain scenarios where it really adds a lot of value, and other scenarios where it maybe not be so applicable.
But you should still reflexively digitize. Yep.
Yeah,
in my view,
absolutely.
justify why you wouldn't.
Great, thanks, guys. Another one here from someone in the audience today. They're asking, is there a way for citizen developers to test and learn as they build processes? Paul, maybe you want to take this one first?
Yeah, that's very interesting because testing a system is so critical to controlling the risk. I mean, you're giving citizen developers very powerful tools. You want to make sure that those tools are used properly. So there's various ways that vendors can make this happen. Like FlowForma, for example, has a thing called a health checker that actually checks the process as it's being built for any errors and automatically reports that to the citizen developer literally as they're building it. And we provide a visual interface where you can see everything that's going on. So we kind of try and make the system basically as declarative as possible. We're kind of showing the citizen developer the system as it's being built, so they can see the end user experience. And then, of course, you can make it as easy as possible, basically, for the system developer to actually test as they build the process. But again, so important as well is that solution that you're building in that low-code tool like FlowForma, you got to be able to give that to the end user and get feedback as soon as possible. So as you're building it, you say, okay, that's the first draft done, get it out there, get feedback from the end user, is it right, is it wrong, and then go back and fix it very quickly and get it back out to them again. So essentially, you're using your end users as your UAT. You're doing it in almost in crazy fast time. Like you're building a solution in like a day, you're getting it out there, you're getting the feedback, you're adjusting it the following day. So that's the way things are going in terms of citizen development testing, which is quite different, I think, to traditional IT build testing. And maybe John would have more to say on that in terms of its
Testing is a whole interesting question when it comes to low code in general, and then also, as we say, citizen development. Because if you're not writing code, the nature of the tests are different. Unit testing, for example, is something you do with code, right? Do you have to do unit tests in low code? No. Is the intent still important? Yeah, if it gets complex enough. How do you do that? Well, everybody's still figuring that out. So I think traditionally, even professional testing people will say, the lower the risk, the less testing you need. And when you're talking about a declarative tool, so you literally are declaring what you want or seeing what you want, as Paul said, then, do you really need to formally test the screen that was a WYSIWYG screen? Because when you built it, you saw what it is, right? So there's some ambiguity there, but in general, less testing, especially the closer you get to business people. Testing correlates to the risk and complexity of the thing.
Great, thanks so much, guys. Unfortunately, we are very tight on time, and I am conscious of people running to other meetings. But before we go, I just want to say thank you so much to John and Paul. That hour flew by. Really appreciate you both joining us today, and I'm sure the audience did as well. Some great conversations were had. Just for our audience, that if they are interested in learning a little bit more about FlowForma, I would recommend signing up for a free trial. You can do so on our website at flowforma.com/trial. We also have demonstrations as well that we can give industry specific information on too. So definitely check out the site. And if we didn't get to answer your question today, I am really sorry, but one of our product experts will be in contact and will be able to help you with any next steps that you need. There's also a quick survey at the end that if anyone could fill out, that would be really appreciated. But again, I want to thank John and Paul for joining me today. Thank you so much, and hopefully we'll all join again soon.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, guys. Bye now.